Hello and welcome to the Masterclass. This is Caelan Huntress, and today we're going to be talking about how to work from home like a boss. Because, like it or not, even if you have somebody else who employs you and tells you what to do, when you work from home, you are more in charge of yourself than ever before. When you work in an office, you can have other people telling you what to do and helping you stay productive. But when you work from home, you are the boss. So let's work from home like a boss. I'll go over a quick agenda of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you some simple strategies to manage your productivity. We'll discuss some communication techniques for managing remote relationships. And I'll give you some practical tools to balance your work life with your home life. And those two portions of your life, your work life and your home life, those used to be different for a lot of us. But now we work at home. These aren't separate anymore. The work life and the home life overlap in a way that they didn't before. And so this requires some specific strategies for overcoming the difficulties that happen when you work from home. The CDC interviewed remote workers a couple of years ago, and 75% of them said that they would probably continue working from home for the rest of their career. Now, what I find so interesting about this new normal that we're in, where everybody's working from home if they're working at all, in quarantine, we've got a lot of people entering the remote workforce. And so I'm curious, do you think this number is going to go up or it's going to go down? If you're watching this live, just drop a word in the chat box. If you think this 75% number is going to go up or going to go down, write one of those two words in the chat box and let me know. Are we going to have more people deciding that they're going to work from home for the rest of their career? Or are we going to have less? Are we getting an influx of remote workers that are going to go back to working in an office? Working from home is super fun because you can have your animals and your pets over you all the time. The culture of working from home is really different than working from an office. And I love seeing people's cats in Zoom calls. I love seeing people's pets and kids. And so it's, in a way, it's made us more authentic in how we communicate with each other, because I'm no longer showing up in just an office. Instead, you're seeing my life with me. And we get a better whole picture of everybody that we're with. There's a lot of really interesting statistics about people who work from home. They waste on average 12 and a half hours of their week, but they work on average 47 hours a week. And when you compare this to the 25 hours that office workers waste every week from their 40 hours a week, there's a pretty stark difference. There was a really big study done with a call center in China. And they selected a random group of their workers. And they said, okay, you're all going to work from home for 6 months, and we're going to measure your productivity. And since it was a call center, they could get some really firm data of how many calls they made and how much time they spent on the calls and what happened after the calls. And what they did was they measured the productivity of workers who were working from home versus workers in the office. And they had a workforce of 16,000 people. And their subset, I think it was 900 or 1,000 who were working from home. And they measured them over time. And they found they were able to demonstrate in hard data that there was a 13% increase in productivity when people were working from home. And then they offered them the choice. Do you want to go back into the office? Or do you want to continue working from home? And they continued measuring them. And they found that productivity gain was lost when they went back into the office. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why we're more productive. And I'll get into some of those during the masterclass. But first, let's just go over a quick agenda. We're going to talk about how to manage and measure your own work, because you are your boss. So we want to work like a boss. I'll give you some training on how to shift your mindset from stress to relaxation and back again, because this is actually a really important shift that we need to do regularly in working from home. I'll give you some ways to communicate clear boundaries with your family and your team. And I'll also share some best practices for virtual meetings and regular reports. And finally, we'll talk about how to maintain a company culture across continents. And at the end, I'm also going to give you a work from home toolbox. I put together some resources into a Google Doc that I've found really helpful in the time that I've spent working from home. And I've been working from home for 10 years. And we homeschool our 3 kids. These are the Huntress kids, the monkeys on my back. Those 2 on the outside, those were the ones that were born in Oregon. And the one in the middle, he was actually born in Costa Rica. And while my wife was pregnant, we went down to Costa Rica and I started running a web design agency. And I've been working from home ever since. And Costa Rica was really great because I was able to take breaks while from my work and then hang out in a hammock and watch my kids play. And it sounds really nice, but it actually presented some really practical difficulties. Right around the corner on this porch was my desk. And I had this beautiful view in Costa Rica, and I was able to work from home and then spend time with my family. And I remember one day I had a lot of client work at this one time. I was launching all these big websites, and my wife was getting frazzled because, you know, she is a stay-at-home mom and she homeschools our kids full time. And at the end of the day, she was fried and ready to hand off the baby. And so I shut the laptop, I turned around at 5 o'clock and I took the baby and gave her a break. And she went out on a hike into the jungle. And the rest of that night was really difficult for me. My mood was really low. I was short with my kids and I wasn't having fun. We weren't laughing. And so at the end of the night, I had this difficult night with my kids. And my wife said, "What was it that was difficult about today?" And I realized that as great as it was to be working from home, I wasn't separating my workspace from my home space, or my work time from my home time. I had overlapped them so much that while I was with my kids, I was still fretting about these websites that I was designing. I was thinking about my clients. I was in work mode while I was at home and I couldn't put it down. I didn't make clear boundaries between my work life and my home life. And really, the big mistake was I didn't have a transition ritual. I couldn't put my day down because I never really ended it. And a transition ritual is automatic when you work in an office. You've got to commute to get there. And so there's this period of time when you're going through a change, when you're signaling to your body and to your mind and to your world, I'm going out of my home life and into my work life. And then you do it in reverse, when you leave your work life and you go to your home life. The commute takes a lot of time. If you used to have a commute earlier this year, type in the chat box and let me know how many minutes you spent in your daily commute, one way, going to work and going from work. How long did you spend in a commute? Take a look at the chat box here. See what we have. Oh, come on, Zoom. Zoom has this great little error where I can't. Here we go. 30-minute walk, says Vince. It's a great time to listen to podcasts. It sure is. So that 30 minutes is part of the 1.8 trillion minutes that NASDAQ measured and said that people were commuting in 2014. They did this big study to measure how long do people commute. And for some reason, this number looks bigger to me when I see it in hours. 29 billion hours spent in commuting. And I don't really agree with the perspective that's really prevalent in this early phase of quarantine, where people are saying, now that you don't have a commute, you can learn a new language or pick up an instrument or get so much more work done. I don't think that that's really honest, because commute time isn't really spent productively. Commute time is spent in transition. And, you know, we're often just kind of going through the motions. We're moving through space. We're getting outside time. The commute time gives us some really important things that we don't get when we work from home. Thankfully, because you're working like a boss, you can manufacture a transition ritual for when you start work and when you start play. And manufacturing these transition rituals is more important when you work from home, because you can look at your work and your play as bread and cheese. And bread and cheese can make a great sandwich. A grilled cheese sandwich, there's nothing like it. It's crispy on the outside and it's gooey on the inside. But you can also use those same ingredients to make something horrible. I was raised in the American South, and there was a dish that was prevalent in my class of people in the American South called Welsh rarebit. And now that I live in the Commonwealth, I know that this is actually a different dish, because the way they make it in the South is they put a piece of Wonder Bread in the microwave and then a slab of Velveeta on top of it and microwave it for a minute. And that's your meal. It's still nourishing. It's still food. But when you compare that kind of dish to a grilled cheese sandwich, you could take the same ingredients and make something fantastic or something disgusting. And that's how I want us to look at work and play, is that you can combine these in good ways and in bad ways. And I find that the best way to combine your work and your home is to look at your environment, your equipment, and your energy. And if you set these things up well, then you're going to have a good experience of working from home. Now, to measure how well you're doing, look at your posture, your productivity, and your passion. These are your barometers, how you can measure how well you're doing in working from home. Your posture is an easy indicator. If you're hunched over, and that's going to affect your mood, it's going to affect your energy, it's going to affect how well you can work. And there's all sorts of different materials out there on how to get good posture in your workstation. And I've got this graphic from the University of Sydney in the Work From Home Toolbox that I'll give you after this masterclass. And it goes through all the details. So I'm not going to get too deep into posture, except I want you to think about your workstation as a cockpit. Your cockpit is set up in such a way that you don't have to set it up continually while you're working. You set it up once and you set it up well. And if you have everything right where it needs to be when you need it, you can soar. But if you have to keep stopping to say, where did I leave that thing? And oh, it's so messy here. I can't find my stuff. If your cockpit is a mess, then your work is going to be a mess. So take care of your workstation so that you can do better work. One of the best ways to take care of your energy is through power-ups. We all have different power-ups, things that rejuvenate us, things that make us feel better. One of my best ones is walking the dog at around 10:30 in the morning. Around that time, I start to get fuzzy-headed, so I grab my dogs and I go around the block and I come back and I'm rejuvenated. And that's what works for me. And you know what works for you. You know what's best to make you feel rejuvenated. And so if you make a list of these personal power-ups and you keep it nearby on your desk, then when you start to feel fuzzy-headed and your productivity lags, then you can select a power-up and then improve your energy so that you feel better. And this works really well with certain time blocking techniques. Does anybody know the Italian word for tomato? If you know the Italian word for tomato, drop it in the chat box if you're watching this live. Yes, Vince got it right away, the pomodoro. The tomato is it's the foundational concept of the Pomodoro technique, which was developed by Francisco Cirillo, and he's a productivity consultant that lives in Berlin. And he found that by setting a timer for 25 minutes and then working straight through and then taking a 5-minute break, alternating between these two states, of work and recovery really amplified his productivity. And so the Pomodoro technique is setting a timer for 25 minutes and then taking a 5-minute break. And you alternate between these two for a number of Pomodoros. That's the sessions that you work. And there's different ways that you can calculate the time. The ultradian rhythm is working for 90 minutes and taking a 20-minute break. There was a really big study by Draugium, and they did all of this analysis using a time tracking app called Desk Time. And they measured the productivity output of a workforce with how long they were working and how long their breaks were. And they found that the optimal length of work and rest was 52 minutes and 17 minutes. So there's different ways that you can set this up, but I offer you these options because when you decide how long you want to work and how long you want to take a break, those are malleable numbers and they're what's going to work for you. But you can't just work through indefinitely. There's this concept in productivity called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And these two psychologists found that that increased stress improves your performance. But there's this peak. And once you go past this peak, more stress degrades your performance. And so what you want to do as your own boss is you want to get up to this peak and then take a break so that you can rejuvenate and you can accelerate again. But if you find yourself going downhill, it's just going to continue going downhill. So listen to your body, listen to your mind, listen to your emotions, use those barometers of your posture, your productivity, and your passion. And when you see things getting low, it's time to make a change. We don't want to stay stressed all day. And we don't want to stay relaxed all day. There's periods for working fast and there's periods for moving slow. You can use anxiety to get things done, but you need to reduce that anxiety in order to get back on the other side of that Yerkes-Dodson curve. And so I find that alternating between states of doing and being is really effective when you're working from home. It's a lot like surfing. If you stay stressed the whole time, or if you stay relaxed the whole time, you're not going to catch any waves. If you're stressed, you won't wait until the right wave comes along. But if you're too relaxed, you won't paddle fast enough to catch the wave. Surfers are really good at this, where you spend time in active relaxation so that when it's time to be stressed, that you can move fast. We have these two nervous systems in our bodies. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response. That's when blood goes out into our limbs so that we can escape or we can defeat an opponent. And while that state of stress can be used to get things done, we also need the relaxation period where blood comes back into the organs. This is when we can recover, when we can heal. And if you spend all your time in just one state, then you're not going to be performing optimally. And this is why I keep a checklist of power-ups right by my desk. I've got it right here. And when I start getting foggy-headed, the worst thing for me to do at that time is think, well, what could I do to recover? What would be really good for me right now? Because then I'm getting into thinking mode and I'm working when really I need to recover. And so it's easy to just look at the list and say, hey, that one looks good. I'm going to do that and just do it. One of my favorites is Qigong. Qigong is a movement meditations that are developed off of traditional Chinese medicine from thousands of years ago. And this is Lee Holden, one of my favorite Qigong teachers. And he's, after this quarantine happened, he put together an immunity emergency kit. It's completely free and it's a set of 20-minute routines. And there's a link to it in the work from home toolbox that I'll give you after this masterclass. And I find Qigong so effective because I can do it at my desk. I put on a Lee Holden routine and there's a video of him saying, okay, now we're going to do these simple movement and breathing exercises. And I stand up and I do them. And then I come right back to work refreshed and rejuvenated. But again, you're going to find what works for you. And so make your list of power-ups based on what you enjoy doing and what you know rejuvenates you. I actually schedule these recovery blocks into my day. And this is what my calendar looks like for next week. And the blue blocks are my recovery blocks. And I schedule these in advance so that, I'm a really productive guy. And when I'm in the midst of it, it's hard for me to stop working and say, okay, now I'm going to devote some time to myself. But if it's blocked out on my calendar and I know intellectually that it's going to make me more productive, then it's easier for me to do it. Now, I block my time in categories like this in the future. But as I go through my week, this tends to break up. And this is how I track my time. Is I might go 15 minutes over or a half hour under, and I just adjust the blocks as I go through my day. So that then I can look back at the week before and see how much time I actually spent on different categories of work. It's like Jim Rohn said, what gets measured gets managed. And if you're not measuring your time, you can't manage your time. So find a way to measure your time in a way that works for you. There's a lot of good online tools, and I've got some linked in the toolbox, the Google Doc I'll give you after this masterclass. There's things like Rescue Time and Toggle, and there's browser-based time trackers where you can just click a button in the corner of your web browser and it'll turn your time tracker on and off and select different categories. There's all sorts of easy ways to measure your time. And if you're going to work from home like a boss, you need to measure your time so you can manage your time. Now, there's a lot of great productivity tips in this book. Getting Things Done revolutionized my capacity as a productive worker. I read this probably 15 years ago, and I've been using the principles in this week in and week out ever since. There's kind of a cult following around this, and the GTD practice is, we call it GTD because it's a way to refer to this entire system of productivity. And I'm not going to describe the whole system, but just I'm going to go over some of the key points because you might find these really helpful. The GTD system is based on an inbox. There's this one location where everything goes. Everything you have to do, every errand you have to run, every communication you have to send, every idea you have. There's one central repository for everything to go. And this can be physical or it could be digital. But you put everything in this one inbox. And that way it keeps your material and your ideas from going all over the place. They're corralled into the inbox. And once your stuff is in the inbox, then you could do one of four things with anything in there. You can do it, you can delegate it, you can defer it, or delete it. Now, this is an oversimplification. It's actually a little more complicated than this. And I have this graph in the Work From Home Toolbox. So if you want to dive deep into it, really what you should do is you should just read the book and get Getting Things Done by David Allen, because it's fantastic. But I want to give you a simple workflow for deciding between those four options. Ask yourself two questions. Can I take the next action? And can I do this in 2 minutes? The 2-minute rule is really effective because it basically says if I can do this in less than 2 minutes, I'm going to do it right then. That's the 2-minute rule. If it takes less than 2 minutes, do it right then. And it prevents all these little tasks from piling up into a mountain of junk that you have to deal with. So if you can do it in less than 2 minutes and you can take the next action, do it right then. But if you can't take the next action and someone else can, then you delegate it. If you can take the next action, but it takes more than 2 minutes, defer it to a specific time in the future. Put it on your calendar, designate the time for it. But if you can't do it in 2 minutes and you can't take the next action, consider deleting it. Because a lot of our productivity is based on what we decide to say no to doing. Saying no to doing work that isn't going to get us to our goals, that's actually going to free up more time than doing busy work unnecessarily. There's a lot of apps that you can use for the GTD system where you have a digital inbox, and it uses the Someday Maybe folder, and it uses all the different things. I use Things by Cultured Code. It's a Mac only app, but it's my favorite, and I've tried them all. Wunderlist is also very good. But I want to highlight Remember the Milk, because it's named after a story that David Allen tells in Getting Things Done. He talks about being in a meeting and going into the meeting and remembering, oh, I have to remember the milk. When I go home, I have to get milk before I go home. And so the whole meeting, he's thinking, I have to remember the milk. Don't forget the milk. And he gets up and leaves the meeting, and he's remembering the milk. And through the whole day, he's holding on to this idea, don't forget the milk. And then when he leaves the office, and oh, I got to remember, don't forget the milk. I got to remember the milk. And he goes in the car and he's thinking about it the whole time. And he's been spending his whole day remembering the milk, instead of putting that idea into a system that he trusts, so that when he gets in his car, a notification pops up and says, remember the milk. Your mind is for having ideas, David Allen says, not holding them. Your mind is like RAM. There's two types of memory in your computer. There's RAM and ROM. RAM, the random access memory, is your processing power. And ROM, read-only memory, is your storage. You might have 1,000 gigabytes of ROM, but only 8 gigabytes of RAM. And so if you are storing your ideas in your RAM, where you're supposed to be processing, it depletes your ability to process things faster. And so getting these ideas out of your head and into a system that remembers these things for you, that's really what the GTD system is about. Manipulating these different mindsets, this is something that's more important for remote workers than office workers. It's like you have two caps. You've got your thinking cap and you've got your doing cap. If you try and wear both caps at once, you're going to look stupid. And you're not going to do either of these very well. There's a mindset shift that happens between 30,000 feet, when you can see the big picture, and down at ground level, when you're moving really slow. If a pilot's on the ground and he says, well, I wonder which runway I should take, that's the wrong time to make that decision. You need to make that decision when you're in the air and when you can actually maneuver well enough to select a different place to land. If you're in thinking mode and you do a lot of thinking tasks, that's really efficient, because then you can go down into doing mode and do those tasks. If you come up with ideas while you're in doing mode, defer them for later so that you can process them while you're thinking. But if you're thinking and then you realize, oh, I can do this thing, and you start to do the do, there's a switching cost. And it takes time to commute down from 30,000 feet all the way to ground level. And it's not an efficient way of thinking. And that's why working from home is batching tasks. You spend time as your own boss, deciding what to do. And then you spend a different period of time doing those things. That's really key, is segmenting these mindsets. And what is it that a boss really does? When we have our thinking cap on, what's really the goal? The goal is setting goals. Goal setting is the work of the boss, deciding what to do. And as your own boss, and like I said, even if you have a boss of somebody else who tells you what to do and sends you a paycheck, that's fine. But working from home, you want to think of yourself as a boss of yourself, so that you could spend time in boss time and spend time in worker time. This is actually my transition ritual, is setting goals. When I start my workday, I write a list of my 3 most important things to accomplish that day. And that signals to my subconscious mind, it's time to work. At the end of my workday, I write a victory log. And I make a list of everything that I've done. Because I'm a productive guy, and I work for a bunch of different clients at once. And if I don't spend the time to actually list out everything I accomplished, it's easy for me to forget that there's so much that I did. And so these are my transition rituals, is setting goals. And I set 3 goals because of a story I heard about Ivy Lee. Ivy Lee was a productivity consultant, and a century ago, in 1918, he called Charles Schwab, who is the president of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. And he said, I'm going to save you a whole bunch of time. I just need 15 minutes of your time. And he said, and Charles Schwab said, I have enough productivity consultants. I don't have the time to do this. I'm not interested. And Ivy Lee said, no, you don't have to pay me. You just got to talk with me for 15 minutes. And then if you decide what I tell you is worthwhile, then we can talk about compensation later, but just give me 15 minutes. So Charles Schwab said, okay. So he invited him in, and they sit down first thing in the morning, and Ivy Lee slides over a piece of paper, and he says, write down a list of the 3 most important things that you have to get done today. And so Charles Schwab wrote a list of those 3 things. And then Ivy Lee said, prioritize them. Put a 1 by number 1, and 2 by number 2, and 3 by number 3. So Charles Schwab did that, and he prioritized them. And then Ivy Lee said, now, here's a note card. Write them in order on this note card. And he did that. And he said, put this note card in your pocket. Work on number 1 until it's done. And if you get interrupted, you can do other things and put out fires and do what you need to do. But when you have that moment where you wonder, what am I doing next? Take out this card and keep working on the top item on the list until it's done. And then cross that off and start working on the next item on the list until it's done. And if you get interrupted, come back to this list that you made in the beginning of the day where you decided what the most important things to do are. And so Ivy Lee left, and 3 months later, he got a check in the mail for $25,000. Which in today's dollars is $400,000. And Charles Schwab included a note that said, this is the most effective productivity technique I've ever used, and I teach it to my top executive team. And it's revolutionized our company. You don't have to pay $400,000 for this technique. I'm giving it to you for free. Writing down this list, it gives you a place to return. When you've been interrupted and you're not sure what to do next, if you decide that in advance and you keep that list easy to access, then you know exactly what to move into as soon as you're ready to get back to it. When you're setting goals, your goals can be vivid or they can be vague. They can be feasible or they can be fantastic. And fantastic goals that are vivid, those are your moonshots. And moonshots are great because, as Les Brown said, even if you miss, you land among the stars. So it's great to have moonshots, but if you don't define them well enough, they're just aspirations. And aspirations are nice, but they don't really get done. I like that saying that a goal is a dream with a deadline. Putting a deadline to it ensures that it's actually going to happen. They did a study in the Harvard Business Review of MBAs who graduated from Harvard in 1979. And they surveyed them as they were graduating and then followed them over the course of their career. And they found that 83% of those MBAs had no written goals. 14% had goals, but hadn't written them down. And 3% of the graduating class had written goals of what they wanted to achieve. So they followed up with these people decade after decade, and they found that the 14% of people who had goals but hadn't written them down, they made on average twice as much as the 83% who didn't have goals. That 3% who wrote down their goals, they made on average 10 times as much as people who didn't have goals. So move from aspirations to moonshots by making your goals vivid, and you can see a lot of things happen. All your goals don't need to be vivid. Your routines don't need to be clearly defined because they're so feasible. They're easy enough to do. But the goals I want to encourage you to make are the SMART goals. These are the ones that are specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-bound. If you have a goal and it doesn't meet all 5 of these criteria, it might just be an aspiration. It's when you make it a SMART goal that you can actually make it feasible by making it vivid. So setting goals is one of the foundational aspects of acting like your own boss, is deciding what to do. But there's another part that's just as important, and that's knowing when to alternate between deep work and shallow work. Deep work, as defined by Cal Newport in the book of the same name, deep work is professional activities performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that push your cognitive abilities to the limit. This is different than shallow work, which is non-cognitively demanding. Tasks that are often performed while distracted. They did a study with Rescue Time where they could analyze the categorization of how people were tracking their time, and they have 50,000 users, and they looked at it and they said, and they found that most employees spend an average of 38% of their time on core skills. And the reason why is because there's so much time that's set aside for interruption. Interruptions are a necessary part of work. If you think about the open office hours of a professor, that's time when they're available to interruption. Academics who are, writing doctoral theses and writing books and academic papers, they need time for deep work. But if they're teaching classes, they designate the time when they are available to interruption. You'll never show up at an open office hours and have the professor say, "Why are you interrupting me? I'm in the middle of this chapter." That doesn't happen. They stay open to interruptions so that they can respond to the goals of others. We need this time in our work. We can't just isolate it out and have no time for shallow work. But we can decide when that time is so that we can protect our deep work time. Carl Jung, the psychotherapist, he had a thriving client practice in Zurich, but he only worked there 2 days a week. He spent another 2 days a week in what he called his retiring room. He had this retreat where he would do deep thinking, and he would write really complicated papers where he was trying to push back against his teacher, Sigmund Freud. And in order to stand against Sigmund Freud, you can't do that while you're distracted. You really need to have the time for deep work. And so Jung had this time for deep work a couple of days a week. And he had another couple of days a week for shallow work when he was available to interruptions. And this is something that's especially important for parents. If you're working from home and you have kids, make time to be available to interruption so you can earn time for solitude. My kids know that if they come up into my office while I'm working or while I have headphones on, if they interrupt me, I'm going to say, "I don't know, go ask your mom." My mom is a full-time stay-at-home mom, and she takes care of the kids while I'm in working time. But sometimes she needs some time to have a phone call or an appointment or get some of her things done. And so during that time, I'll either schedule a break or I'll bring my computer down to the dining room table, and I'll do shallow work at the dining room table. And my kids know if they interrupt me while I'm at the dining room table, it's totally fine because I've delineated clear boundaries. So if we look at interruption time and focus time, staying available to interruption, that's great for shallow work. If you end up not being interrupted, you can do all your shallow work and get to that mythical land of inbox zero. If you set aside time for focus time and you can do deep work, that's where your best work is. It's only when you try and do deep work while you're being interrupted that you're going to get frustrated. So that's the hazard. We don't want to do deep work during periods of interruption. And the way that you do this is by communicating clear boundaries. Clear boundaries are what allow you to earn time for deep work, where you can be focused, where you can remain uninterrupted. But these boundaries have to be defended. Because if you're inconsistent or you're unclear, people will ask for more than you can give. You'll be a pushover if you're clear with your boundaries, but you don't defend them. You'll be overrun with other people's requests if you're consistent in your boundaries, but you're unclear about what they are. And the worst is if you're unclear about your boundaries and you're inconsistent about defending them, because people won't trust you. When you say, well, I need this time, they'll say, yeah, sure you do. It's only when you have clear boundaries that you consistently defend that people will respect those boundaries. When you're playing chess, there's clear delineations between one square and the next. If there were fuzzy boundaries, then I could put a piece kind of over here and maybe nudge it over, and then the game would be a mess, and we wouldn't have agreed upon rules by which we could play. It's only because of the clear boundaries that the game works. Boundaries are especially important with communicating with a remote team. And I'm going to share with you the best communication tip I've ever learned about communicating with people remotely. And you can see this at unlessiheardifferent.com. There's a 3-minute video. This is all totally free. It's just, this was made by Chase Reeves and Chris, I can't remember his name, but these two guys, they had a conversation and recorded a video about it and gave this idea that has saved me so much time. You know how you get an email and then it CCs some other people and it brings a whole bunch of people in, and it's ballooning into this big project where nobody really knows what's happening, what's coming next, how to achieve victory. Nobody really knows. This can be solved when one person says, unless I hear different, I'm going to do this and this and this. That's it. You make a plan and you give other people the opportunity to object, so that they could say, well, wait, you haven't thought about this, or you haven't included this thing, or talked to this person. Give people the option for doing that, but proactively take the stance that you are going to get things done, unless you hear different. This simple phrase, unless I hear different, it's like magic, because it relieves the burden off of so many other people trying to figure out, how are we going to accomplish this? What's really going to get done? If you charge in and say, hey, I've got a plan, and unless I hear different, this is how I'm going to solve these problems, then you're helping everybody else. So unlessiheardifferent.com, go check that out later. This sort of communication is an example of asynchronous communication. If you're watching this webinar live, then we're synchronous. It's the same time. But if you're watching this on a replay, it's asynchronous. I'm creating this communication at a different time than you are consuming it. And remote teams need both of these channels. They need a synchronous channel and an asynchronous channel. And it's best when they clearly define which is which. So for some teams, Slack is the synchronous channel and email is the asynchronous channel. And if you get a Slack message, then you need to get to it right away. But if you get an email, you can get to it within the next day or two. And again, this is all about clear communication. I have a protocol with all of my clients that I respond to all emails in 24 hours. So they know that they can reach me asynchronously via email. But if somebody texts me on my phone, that's synchronous. And I really don't respond to asynchronous requests in a synchronous medium, because that trains people on where my boundaries are, and being consistent with those boundaries is important. I once lost a client because we were scheduling things via text, and he had opened up the synchronous channel by texting me saying, hey, can we meet on Friday at 3 p.m.? And so I said, oh, I can't meet then, but I can meet at this time. And we went back and forth throughout the day trying to schedule a meeting. And turned out he was at a waterfall with his friends the whole time and had to stop hanging out with his friends at this beautiful waterfall to troubleshoot when we were going to meet. And there were other issues with that client, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back, was that we were using a synchronous medium for an asynchronous communication. And that really taught me the importance of communicating properly. That if you need to talk about something now and it's shallow work and it's urgent, use a synchronous channel. If it's something that isn't immediately urgent and you can talk about it any time, use an asynchronous channel. Nobody uses the bat phone to ask Bruce Wayne out to brunch. This is an immediate synchronous communication. Batman, we need you now. That's what the bat phone is for. But if you're scheduling a gala for next month, then you send an invitation through the mail and you give the other person time. And respecting other people's time in this way, this is one of the ways to foster good relationships, is through good communication. And I'll give you another tip as well. Don't be the bottleneck. If you are the dependency and there's a project that's waiting for you to accomplish something before it can be handed off to somebody else, get that done right away. Get it off your plate. Because if you are in the bottleneck, then nobody's going to be able to fill their glasses. So now let's get into some best practices for virtual meetings. I love virtual meetings. I've been remote for 10 years, living in different countries around the world, but I've been able to maintain relationships and run group masterminds and manage remote teams because I run good virtual meetings. And I'm going to share with you some of the best practices that I've learned over time. Whenever you send an invitation, set an agenda and include it in the invitation. I like doing this in the calendar invite itself. There's a notes section, and I just go ahead and pop in a few bullets. We're going to talk about this and this and this. And that way, when you begin the meeting, everybody knows what you're there to talk about. It gives other people the opportunity to prep for the meeting. One of the things I do in the morning after I set my 3 big goals for the day is I look over my appointments and I spend a little bit of time thinking, what are we going to talk about on this meeting and what questions can I bring? If you write your questions beforehand, then it gives you a way to fill the empty space. Because on virtual meetings, sometimes there can be awkward silences where we can't read body language and we don't really know how to move into the next step. And if you can say, hey, I have a question about this topic, and it's a considered question, something that you thought about in advance, then that really helps move the meetings along. And finally, I really like engaging everyone early in a meeting. That's why at the beginning of this masterclass, if you're watching live, I was asking for, can you hear me? Drop a message in chat. Getting people in the habit of engaging early in the meeting is really helpful because then they feel more ready to engage later. It's a lot harder to get somebody to make their first engagement 10 minutes after the meeting starts. One of my simple ones is, hey, can everybody hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Do you hear me right now? And if everybody's got their cameras on, I see thumbs up. That's an engagement. So engage everybody early in the meeting. A virtual meeting is like a military convoy. And a convoy can only stay in formation if it moves at the speed of the slowest vessel. If you and somebody else take off in one direction and you go off on a tangent, and there's somebody who's left behind, you're no longer in formation. And so you want to make sure that everybody's brought along. Because in a virtual meeting, you don't have the same advantage as an in-person meeting where you're sitting around a conference table and you can see that somebody is checked out. You can sense with their energy that they're not really paying attention. With a virtual meeting, that's a lot more difficult because they could be scrolling Facebook while you're having a really in-depth conversation and they're not paying attention and you don't really know. That's why asking questions of other people is really helpful. I really like to end my points with a question directed at somebody. I really think that this is going to help us do a lot of great things. What do you think, Patrick? And then Patrick says, well, yes, blah, 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 blah. And so hand off the baton to other people by asking directed questions. It's really helpful. Now I'll share some best practices with reporting. Sending regular reports is really helpful when you're a remote worker because it keeps people informed about what you're working on and what's coming next. There's this type of meeting that's really frequent in tech teams that use the agile methodology. There's this type of meeting called a stand-up meeting. And in a stand-up meeting, all the engineers stand up and talk about what they're doing that day. Stand-up meetings are great because you can do them across multiple time zones And you can do them virtually. And in this photo, everybody's looking at a monitor where all the virtual people are. And they're taking this time early in the day to say, hey, this is what we're working on. This is what I'm working on today. And I hit these problems. And it gives somebody else the opportunity to say, hey, have you talked to that person? Or have you thought about this thing? Or do you know about this resource? And you get this cross-pollination of ideas. But most importantly, you get a pulse. Everybody gets a pulse of what's happening on the team. And you can only maintain a pulse if it's done regularly. When you're on a remote team, pulses and reports can be done daily or weekly or monthly. And so if you think about what kind of report you can send them at the beginning of the time period with your plan, or you can send them at the end of your time period with a review of what happened. Daily reports are really great for direct reports. You send a list to your boss with a bullet list of, these are the things that I worked on today. Boom, boom, boom. And they also work in reverse, where a boss can say, hey team, this is what's happened today. Boom, boom, boom. But they don't need to be long. Nobody needs to read a chapter of your novel every day. But having a short bullet list, that's a pulse. If you send weekly reports, then you can communicate what your priorities are for the week so that people know what you're going to be working on. If you send a retrospective at the end of the week, these are the problems that I faced. It gives other people an opportunity to contribute to solving those problems if you're sending updates regularly. Monthly reports are really great for executives in large organizations because monthly reports give them something to share. And executives love documentation. If they can go back and say, well, here's the last 6 months of reports from our sales team. Then and if it's got charts and graphs, it allows them to measure the progress. And that progress, it gives them the material they need to make better strategic decisions. So in addition to reports, there's also this thing that we have in teams called culture. And in-person teams, they manufacture culture in an office. And that office is the Petri dish. That's where the culture happens. You can still make a culture remotely, but it requires a different Petri dish. And I'll talk about culture in a second, but first I want to review the agenda so that we can see make sure we've hit all our points. We talked about managing and measuring your own work. We talked about the mindset shifts from stress to relaxation and why it's important to go back and forth. How to communicate clear boundaries with your team and your family. The best practices for virtual meetings and regular reports. And now we'll talk about maintaining a company culture across continents. But real quick, I do want to let you know, there is a free Google Doc that has a whole bunch of resources, things that we've talked about in this masterclass, as well as additional resources that I've put in there for you. And that'll be available somewhere around this. There's a button if you're watching this on the replay. And if you're watching this live, then I'll email you a link to this with a link to the replay. So remote culture is different than in-person culture. There's a lot of companies that after this quarantine has started in this pandemic of 2020, that are now faced with migrating their culture from an office culture to a remote culture. A lot of the crutches that we use for culture, the ping pong table in the office, the free coffee and donuts, the water cooler, those sorts of things aren't available to us remotely. And so we have to prop up the culture with different techniques. And you can do that as long as you're intentional about it. Now, the baseline scenario, what people are hoping for in this transition is that they have just as much culture and productivity as they did before. That would be good enough, is if we went from an office culture to a remote culture and things are just as good. Now, hopefully, people will see their teams become more productive. And they'll get some of these documented productivity gains that data has shown us happens when you move to a remote team. But if we don't get that, then we could get employees that are resentful. And the hard part about remote culture is that you don't know when this resentment happens. You don't feel the glares in the office. You don't cut the tension when you walk into a room. All of those indicators that you get for an in-person office, They don't happen with a remote team. So you have to discover ways to uncover, are people resentful? Are they being deceptive? Are they not telling me some things? It's easy to look over somebody's shoulder in an office and see what they're working on, but you can't really do that with a remote team. But the good news is, just as things can go really off the rails, things can also go much better. I've worked on some remote teams where people get proactive, where they start meeting independently and moving forward on projects where they take ownership of it because the culture has encouraged them to move things forward and to advance the company's mission on their own. And that's one of the things that I really like to see, when a good culture helps people become proactive and contribute to the goals of the company. So I have some ways that I can help people do that. I'm piloting a 1-month culture conversion right now, where I work with a company to interview their employees and find out what the real difficulties are with working remotely and with managing communication without the team. I've also been doing some comms upgrades where I do an audit of all the communications of a company, because now is not the time for that autoresponder that says, you should go to the beach this weekend, you deserve it. Those kinds of messages hidden in your marketing automation systems are falling on really flat ears. So doing an audit of those communications and upgrading them is one of the things I've been doing a lot lately. I also have a 1-day productivity workshop where I work with a remote team to train them on some of the productivity tools that we've discussed today. And I also offer 1-to-1 coaching and consulting. And managing remote teams has been really valuable for me because when I went to Costa Rica and started my web design agency, I thought I was going to be a solopreneur for good. But I started working with clients rather, that had teams that didn't know how to manage the productivity of the team and how to keep everyone aligned with a weekly pulse. And so I started doing this thing called Trello Tuesdays, which was a super big hit because it combined productivity and culture in such a way that I was able to bring remote teams closer together. I also worked with a large client who I can't name because of an NDA, but they're the world's largest credentialing organization. And I was managing a team of sales reps across the Asia Pacific region. And many of these employees were working from home. And helping these employees become productive and feel part of a team, it helped stave off the loneliness and the bitterness that can happen with work from home employees. And helping people get more productive and enjoy their work more, that's something that I really love to do. And so I'm looking for people to have conversations with about these sorts of offers. So if you run a team or you know somebody that has a team that needs new training on their new technology, or they need a communications upgrade, I'm offering free 30-minute consultations. And so you can go to caelanhuntress.com/talk and fill out a short form that'll allow me to come to our conversation prepared with ideas. And then that'll flip you to my scheduling calendar so that we can schedule a time. And there's no obligation on this call. If you just want to pick my brain and get some free ideas, get some feedback on what's happening in your organization, I'm happy to do that too, because I'm really curious right now about the specific challenges that people are doing or that people are facing. And so this consultation is not a sales call. It's about you and about the issues that you're facing, because I want to know what's challenging for you and your team and what sorts of difficulties are you facing, because I'm looking at finding ways to help people in this time where everybody is suddenly remote, whether you like it or not. So this has been my masterclass of how to work from home like a boss. If you liked it, I encourage you to share it. There's going to be a link somewhere around here to on the replay to share this with your friends. And if you know anybody who's new to remote working that would find some of this material valuable, then I encourage you to share it with them. So thanks so much for attending, and good luck out there. Have fun.